Okay.
Just FYI. Good morning. Have you been on Clubhouse today?
Morning. Huh? Yeah, I just like check the rooms every once like now and then, but I didn't see anything I was interested in listening to.
There's a really good meditation one. I'm not sure if you're big into meditation, but there's one that goes on like every morning, super
Really?
early, and they just talk about their life, and it's really inspiring. It's fun to listen to.
I feel like that would be a good way to start the day.
It is, yeah. So I actually have a journal as well that is like introspective, and there's a prompt every day. So I'll listen to that meditation Clubhouse room, and then I'll fill out the journal entry for the day, and it's just a great way to start my morning.
I actually just started journaling, and I have a friend. I wasn't sure if I wanted just like a plain one or one with prompts.
Yeah.
And my friend who's like super into journaling, she was like, you should get a plain one. And then if you feel lost or you don't know what to say, you can Google different prompts that you could use and then like
Yeah.
use that to guide you.
Yeah, there are so many different prompts on Pinterest as well. So like if you're interested in just introspective prompts or fiction-based prompts or short story prompts, they have a bunch of them. I mean, people will just add different prompts for everything you can even think of if you're stuck or feeling like you want to journal but you don't really know what to journal about. Because some people that really enjoy journaling just don't know how to begin.
That's how I am. Like, I really like it, but sometimes I'm just like, I don't know what I'm going to write, but I like feel like I want to write something.
Yeah. Yeah, my journal, it's called the Better Everyday Journal, and there are specific prompts for each day. So like
Okay.
here are a couple days in March, and they just have prompts like what's the last dream you remember or what makes you angry, and every month is a different kind of headline. So like January, February, and March are all about self-awareness. So they have specific prompts that deal with trying to figure out who you are. But every month after that is a different subject. It's really cool.
That does sound cool.
But I found them on Instagram. It was an Instagram ad, and I was like, I need this.
I wish I had, like, I was looking for journals and I was like researching a ton and I didn't get any catered ads towards it. Like, I was hoping that Instagram would be like, oh, we see you're looking for one. And it just didn't
Yeah.
happen.
Yeah, I mean, this one, I saw it on an Instagram ad and it just popped off my feed. I was like, I have to get that because it's so cool. But regardless, let's just jump right into the interview, shall we?
Okay.
So can
You want
you
me to like introduce myself and then like, I don't know.
Yeah, so the first question was just going to be detailing your education background and how you got into the MLB and also the player development realm.
Okay. So I started off originally, or graduated college as a human biology major. And the plan was I was going to go to college, human bio major, go to med school, become a doctor. And when I got to college, I needed a job just so I'd have money, like normal college student stuff. So I got a job with the baseball team. And originally I was just doing laundry for them. But then after like a couple months, I was like, I kind of want to do more, like the other stuff that they have like available for jobs seems really cool. So I spoke to my supervisor and he taught me how to do a lot of stuff on the field and like the different technologies and like the things that actually in player development they use, like tracking like how you're doing or like what pitches you're swinging and missing at the most, like that type of stuff. So I started doing that, and then I became head manager by my second year and started traveling with the team. And like when I graduated, I still was like, okay, like now time to study for the MCAT and go to med school. Like that was still the plan. So while I was looking for biology jobs after I moved back home to New Jersey, I saw a job at a baseball agency and I was like, oh, that'd be kind of cool. Like I did like working in baseball and that's where all of my experience is. So I applied for and got that. And then I moved back to LA. I went to USC, by the way. So I moved back to LA, started working there. And from that then on, I was like, okay, like I think baseball is it, just because I wanted to be a doctor so that I could help people. And I realized while working at the agency, like you can help people in baseball. Like there are tons of recently drafted players or soon to be drafted players or international players who they don't know what they're doing, and like people can try to help them, but like they really need someone professional to be able to guide them through the process. So like I learned that at the agency, and then from there I just like tried to figure out exactly where I would fit in baseball. So after being at the agency, I went to work for MLB Replay, and then after Replay I went to the Arizona Fall League, and that's when I really like was in the player development world, and realized I wanted to work for a team. But I was a little late to start reaching out to teams. So then I worked for the World Baseball Classic, which was recently was shut down in March before we got to play our first game because of COVID. So during the time that it was shut down, I started working for a marketing company, and I started reaching out to all different like teams and people and just like asking for advice, not for a job, but just like, hey, do you have any advice on what I could do during this time to like improve myself? Because I knew a lot of people would kind of just be waiting for things to start back up, and I needed to do something to like put myself in a good position for when next season started. So I started helping out with a potential MLB expansion team, the Nashville Stars, and Dave Dombrowski, who's an ex general manager and now the president of baseball operations for the Phillies, actually. He was in charge of me, so I like would ask him for advice, and we had just a long talk about baseball operations and the different parts of it. And I think the fact that I like took the initiative to talk to him and like try to learn as much as I could did eventually set me aside from everyone else. So when I started emailing teams, they're like, we don't really have availability, but like we're still willing to talk to you. And that's what happened with the Tampa Bay Rays. And now I'm there working in player development as assistant of minor league operations.
That's epic. I mean, everyone gets into sports differently. And I think that's what's so insane about trying to find your way, because no one has the same story. It's not like, okay, you pass an exam and then you do this and then this and then this and then suddenly you're at the top. People get in different ways. I mean, you were not a sport anything major in college.
Yeah. And I think once I got into baseball, it felt like my only path was to work at an agency, because most people who want to work for a team, they start doing minor league video ops and then they like do a bunch of internships with teams. Whereas like if you started an agency, it's completely different. Like the stuff you know is different and the things you're looking for. But I think that also set me apart from people, because I did have different experiences, and like through a lot of interviews, a lot of people were like, oh, wow, we like that you were a biology major, because that means you have like good attention to detail and like you must read a lot, and like a lot of these different things that I guess just made me different. So they're like, oh, we might as well take a chance and see how it goes.
Yeah, I mean, I came into sports from the broadcast perspective, so you and I's outlooks on the sports world are very different, and even within my broadcast experience, people are coming in from different directions. So it's cool to talk to you because you are so out of the box, different in the way that you entered this industry.
Yeah, I mean, I think part of it was because I didn't have, like with med school, there was a clear, like, go to school, major in science, study, take the test, get into school. And for this, because it was so abstract, I wasn't able to say, by this age, I want to be at this point in my career, which ended up being helpful because it let me try opportunities I wouldn't have if I knew there was like a specific path.
So, with your biology background, would you ever look into going into something more body movement or kinesthetic based as opposed to player development?
I'm not very interested in like mixing biology and sports. I
Okay.
do like both of them a lot, and I like when I studied like motion and those types of things in school, I really liked it. But I think the things that I like in baseball are very different than anything that has to do with like biological aspects of the game. So I wouldn't be as interested. But I definitely would want to like speak to trainers and speak to the people who work with like motion and all of that stuff and like learn what they're doing, because it does really interest me. It's just not something I'd like to work in.
So, what does a day in your life contain? Are you talking to those kind of people on a daily basis, or are you mostly communicating within your player development department?
So I'm talking to everyone, because player development's the one department that touches everything in baseball. Because it's like a lot of them don't really like communicate with the minors, but they obviously like have an eye on the minors. So I'm working with minor leaguers, I'm working with major leaguers, rehab players, the front office, like I'm talking to everyone, and every single day is completely different, which I think just in general in sports, every day is different because you never know what's going to happen or who's going to get traded or like who's going to get injured. But mainly like in player development, it's about making sure that you're kind of the link between everything and like all the information gets to everyone who it needs to get to.
So, what is the impact of the redistribution of the minor leagues to the majors? I mean, we were talking about that in the pre-interview and what impact the minor leagues have on the scouting in the majors.
I think, okay, so the redistribution, I was fortunate enough to hear Rob Manfred talk about it when I was working at MLB, because we had like an all staff meeting, and he basically said that there's some teams that are in a league and they're 8 hours away from the closest team. So like for those other teams to play them, it's like, oh, it's annoying when you have this 1 8 hour trip. But for them, every single trip is really far away, and they have to deal with like the toll that takes. And like, okay, you're gonna be exhausted because you have to get on a bus and like ride all the way there and then come home super late and then have a home game, like things like that, that you wouldn't even think about. And so he was like, sometimes it just like makes sense to rework it or to like get rid of certain teams. And then since it hasn't happened yet, or like hasn't completely happened, we don't know for sure what the impact's going to be. But I personally think that if there are fewer teams, then hopefully that means that a lot of the money that was being put into certain teams will be redistributed amongst like the remaining teams, and it'll give more money for each team, a better quality of play, and then hopefully a better quality of life for the players.
Yeah, I mean, you and I were talking extensively about the mental health toll that it takes being in the minors at any level. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
single A, double A, triple A, there's
Yeah.
a big toll, and the money is not there to support the
Mm-hmm.
minors as much as it should be, I guess.
Mm-hmm. And I think they're moving in the right direction towards like making sure that the players are going to eventually have like the compensation they need. Because when you think about the pay, or like if someone were to break down the pay, you'd be like, okay, that's not that bad. But then you think like they're working 8 months of the year, and then the remaining 4 months of the year, they need to find a job that's willing to hire them just for those 4 months, or like they need to live off the money that they made in the previous months. And it's just like, that's when you realize that it's really hard to be a minor leaguer.
Yeah. So what's the process of, from your perspective, bringing a minor league player into the majors? What process goes on from a player development perspective?
I think a big thing is poise. Maybe they have the skills necessary, but you need to make sure that they're like mentally mature enough for it. And in addition to that, they have to like, I guess like having the minors is really important in baseball. And honestly, like I think in a lot of sports, it would be beneficial, just because going from being in college to the majors or high school to the majors, you suddenly have that big change where you're like, oh, now I'm on my own. Like I have all this money. I don't know what to do with it. Or like I get to make my own schedule for the first time rather than having everything like planned out after my class and after practice and all of that. And I think just like being in the minors, it helps you develop that more adult mentality of thinking like, even though this is really fun and I love doing it, it's also my job. So I have to treat it like a job and I have to take it seriously.
Yeah, I mean, when I was working in the Pirates organization, the player development people came and took some time out of their year to stay with us, but I don't know what the process was like because we were a short season single A team and far away from the major league.
I mean, so I don't know if they did something that I was fortunate to be part of was prospects and expectations, which is something that they put a lot of the like big name minor league prospects through. And it's basically a seminar explaining like what to expect and like how your life's going to be after, and like things to stay away from, and just like general things that normal people learn as they're growing up. But since they're living a completely different life, they're like laying it out for them. It's like, you're going to be under a microscope. Everyone's going to see your tweets from like 2012. Like these are all these things that you have to like take into account. So I think having player development go to all the different affiliates, it's helpful because you can see one, like what differences there are from one level of the minors to the next, and like if there's anything that needs to be fixed, and then also just what the mentality of players in each different level is, so you can properly prepare them for the next level.
Yeah, that's a huge issue, especially when you're coming from high school directly into the majors.
Mm-hmm.
I mean,
And like
basketball does that, and it's ridiculous.
it's
And what were you saying? Sorry.
Oh, I was gonna say, like with basketball, that's when you get all the reporters saying like all these kids care about is like what they're wearing and blah blah blah. And it's like, well, obviously they care about the game because they are still playing really well, but it's like you have to remember these kids are 19 or 18. Like you have kids who are just 1 year removed from school. So obviously their priorities are different than someone who's like in their 30s or has a family.
So how do you bridge the gap of talking to those two very different demographics about the same personal development kind of aspects?
I think it's important to know who the individual is or try to get to know them, because like even if you have two guys who came from high school or two guys who came out of college, they're going to be completely different because like everyone's life is very different. So it's important to understand like what type of person there are, if they are mature or if they're a little immature, and just kind of like figuring it out, because you can have a guy who went through college and is still very, very immature, doesn't know how to do things for himself. Or you could have a guy out of high school who's like used to taking care of a bunch of siblings, or like taking care of his grandparents after school, or like having to balance his schedule or have a job. Like you never know what it is. So I think it's important, even if guys came from like are the same age or came from the same like type of background, you still need to know like each individual is different. And I think that's how I deal with like each situation.
So how much of your job and welcoming these new players in is based on draft psychology? Because that's a huge part of the game that agents look into before they bring anyone into the organization. So does your department work with those kind of mentality shifts, or is it more once they're in the organization, now there are issue? Well, I don't
I
want to say issue, but like
Yeah, when you said
you
issue,
know
that's
what I
what
mean.
I know that's what no you meant. But it's something that you think of before, like you take into account everything about the player beforehand, like the same way agents do. That's how teams are looking at guys, and like things like how well they do in school, like what their social media looks like, which is honestly a huge thing now. Like I have a friend who works for a different team, and he part of his job when he first started was to just go through guys' social medias and like see if they said anything that was questionable, and then like from what they said compare like, okay, like they said this because they come from this background, or like they said this because they were this age, and really weigh like the difference, and like they stopped this behavior once they turned 14 or like they turned 16. So it's a big deal. I think it's a big deal to understand who the players, what their challenges in life are, and like I guess how they've grown from it, and then try to evaluate what their potential for growth is. Like if you think there's someone who's never really gonna mentally get there, like that's gonna make a difference. Or if there's someone who has a lot of problems with their coaches, like that's something that you have to think about. It's not just all like, oh, on the field he's perfect, we'll figure the rest out later.
So how does mental health function into the job that you do for the Rays and
um
also your previous work?
it's a big deal. Like they're well, for one, just in terms of like being drafted, especially guys who are drafted, I guess every guy has a different battle. Like once they're drafted, some of them it's like being a first rounder. And once you get to the minor leagues, it's really hard for you because you get othered by the other players. Like they're like, oh, like that's the first rounder, he's got 2 million, blah blah blah. And it's like you don't get to be who you are anymore, you're just the first rounder. And like that can almost make it harder to make friends. So like you have to mentally prepare them for being in a different, like being seen differently than they're used to. And then for guys who weren't drafted and just signed for like even $1,000, that happens. Like guys will sign for $1,000, like they have that mindset of like, I'm not good enough, like I have to prove it, no one is my friend, or like maybe someone's my friend but like I don't really trust anyone around me. Like the mindsets are very different. And then there are just people who are battling like a lot of different mental health issues in general, and it's just important to make sure that you understand what's happening and you help them accordingly, just because it's important. Like player development's about developing the guy off the field and making sure he's as good as or better as the guy that's on the field, because you're not going to play well if you have a ton of other things on your mind, or if just like there's a lot going on with you. So it's about making sure like the player as a whole is doing well. So like in player development, it's very important to understand like where they're coming from and know what their mental state is and help them get to the best place that they can be.
I mean, a lot of sport mental health is about compartmentalization of what you're doing and making sure that what's happening off the field does not impact what's happening on the field. Or if it does, finding a way to channel it differently so that it works to your advantage.
And one thing for player development is like, since they're the liaison, it could be something when you take a visit and you just check in on a player again. You say like, hey, I heard XYZ happened, just wanted to make sure you're okay. And the coach had no idea that anything had happened to them. So you had to make sure that the coach knows that there's something going on so that they understand, oh, maybe they're underperforming because this thing happened, not just because like they're a bad player or they're one of those players who is out partying or like they just like aren't good anymore. Like it's important that you make sure everyone knows everything going on so that they can help the player the best way they can.
So, are you actively keeping tabs on every single player in the organization?
No, not yet. I don't think there's ever going to be a point when I am. And I spoke to a GM from another team when I was looking for jobs, and I was like, yeah, I just feel like it's very difficult to keep track of everything going on. But like, I'm sure that's your job. Like, you know how to do that. Like, you're very good at balancing it. And he's like, yes and no. Like, yes, that's my job, but I have an entire team around me. Like, it's not like I'm doing this on my own. So it's important to know that like when you're in a position where you have a lot of responsibility, you're not doing it on your own and you're not keeping track of everything on your own. Just like do what's manageable and like what you think is an appropriate amount, and then make sure that the people around you know how much you're doing.
So, when a player gets relegated to the minors on injury,
Mm-hmm.
how much of that do you follow?
It's so I work a lot more with like player education and life skills, but that is an important thing for me, like knowing like players are on rehab and like they're dealing with XYZ issues, because we do still have to figure out how to best help them. And a lot of players that come from the majors to the minors kind of have that mentality of like, okay, I'm kind of on my own, I'm just going to do my stuff and then I'm going to get back to the majors and like that's my life. But it's important to keep track of like what's going on with them and to check in with them, and just to be aware of like what type of player it is. Like, if is it some vet who's like for sure going to bounce back, or like what type of injury it is? Like, is it something that's going to take a long time, and just making sure that they understand like you can't rush the process and we're trying to help them in the safest way possible. So I think everyone in player development kind of plays a role in making sure that all the players are okay, like especially guys who are rehabbing.
Yeah, I mean, with teams like basketball, where if you do get injured, you sit the bench, versus organizations where you actually have a built-in buffer that you can go back to when you're injured and then work back up. Do you think that is building confidence in the player, or do you think it's a detriment to their mental health when they have to go back to a lower team?
I'm not sure actually, because I think it's good for them to know that you're going to be able, like with basketball, if you get injured and then you come back, I feel like you're coming back and trying out like how you healed on like the highest level. So like if you're healing okay, but like you're not at your best, you're going to look really bad compared to all the professional players who are like at their healthiest and like still playing at that same level. So I feel like it's a good thing to be able to go down get better and then like play a few games and figure out when you're really ready to go back. But then it's also hard because if you're expecting to be able to go back a lot sooner and it takes longer because your injury is not healing properly, like that's definitely going to take a toll on your mental health.
So, what goes into evaluating a player's ability to get to the majors?
It varies depending on if they're a position player or a pitcher. But the main things, well, some people wouldn't expect that I thought was really interesting when I first learned about player evaluation like a while ago is you look at their parents. Like if you have the option to do that, you see like, okay, this kid's tall for his age, but his parents and him are the same height. Like he might not grow anymore. Like little things like that make a difference. Or like, oh, this kid's 6 foot tall, but his dad's 6'6", like he's probably going to keep growing. So that's a really interesting thing that goes into it. Also, like if they're a pitcher, how much effort they put in with their delivery, if it's repeatable. So if it's like sometimes they throw it one way and sometimes they like have a completely different mechanics and they're just adjusting to like what they want to do. And then just I think one of the main things, and it's a theme throughout player development, is how much poise they have. Like, even though they're young, how do they handle themselves on the mound, or how do they handle themselves in high pressure situations where like them not catching a fly ball or them not like being able to throw to first fast enough could be the difference between a win and a loss or like a win and a tie. So just like seeing how composed they are throughout the game, like that's a very big thing. And that's why players aren't judged based on just like one game or one tournament. It's by how they're doing. Like that's why they watch them multiple times. They try to see as many games as possible and they want to see how they progress from the first time they saw them to the next time they see them.
So, when you're talking about the flow of the game, what is the biggest change that happens between the minors and the majors in terms of the game quality?
Probably the fans, honestly. The fans are one big thing, and then the number of umpires, which people don't realize that in the minors there are fewer umpires than in the majors. Like you don't have an umpire in every single um, like part of the field, and that's not going to be a huge deal. But like if there's a check swing or something, you might have fewer eyes on it to like be able to challenge it. So like that's a little thing that changes. And then having fewer fans, it can be hard to feel like you're a professional baseball player if the fans are empty or the stands are empty. So like that is another thing that makes a difference. And that's more of a mental thing. I personally don't know how players feel how players feel when it's empty. Like maybe some of them are able to focus more, but I think in general they prefer more fans.
Yeah, it's really strange when working in the minors and you get only a handful of fans and you have to almost pretend that you're not watching a professional baseball team. I mean, that has to play a role in their mental health. I don't know how it can't. I just don't know how much of
Mm-hmm.
how
And also,
important it is to the process of their success.
also, I think like feeling like you're in a major league game makes you feel more like you're very close to it or it's attainable. Because when I worked at the fall league, we had one stadium that had cameras. So like the players were able to look back and see how they did in certain games, and they could share the video online and say like, oh, I struck this person out, I struck that person out. But then in other stadiums, they didn't have that option. So I think that made a big difference for them too, because it was like, okay, in a I'm at a stadium that's really far out and no one can really see me and there's no proof that I was even here really, versus I'm at a stadium, they're filming my game, I can show this to people and it like looks like I'm on TV, and like that's something that you do think about.
Yeah, that's a really cool aspect. But the detriment of having your games televised and broadcast is that now you have an instant replay component that changes the game. So can you go into the change in the quality of the game that comes along with being able to replay every single action?
So I think from a player standpoint, they're still going to play the same. Like since they're not in charge of deciding whether they get to steal or if they're going to swing or all that stuff, like it's their managers that are deciding. The players are just still thinking, okay, I'm going to do what the manager tells me to do. And even if they don't agree with it, they're still going to do it. But I think it makes a difference. I personally think it makes a difference in terms of the players that end up being brought up, just because with instant replay, like if there are fewer players stealing, then they're not going to worry about guys who have as much speed when they could get a guy who has like a better bat or like slightly better things in other areas. So like that could be the difference between a guy getting released or making it to the majors because they decide, you know what, like this isn't as valuable of an aspect in the game anymore. So I think that makes a big difference. And then also just knowing that even if you're like a millimeter off the bag when they tag you and something that the naked eye would have thought was safe and now you're out, like you're less likely to make decisions that could be risky. And I think that's honestly making a big difference for like the mental health of the managers because they had to think, okay, if I challenge this and I'm wrong, then I'm going to look dumb because everyone's going to say, well, of course they were safe. Like everyone could see it from a mile away. Or if I don't challenge this and then instant replay shows that slow-mo version where you can see clearly they were off the bag when they tagged them, like then everyone's going to give me grief and say like, I lost the game. So that's definitely something that changes a lot. And I think it affects managers a lot more and then players that are coming up the system.
So how frequently are you in conversation with the managers as opposed to the players?
Um,
Are you, is
I
that a portion of what you do? Or is it more
I will
directly you to the players?
I will be working with coaches. I'm not sure which level yet. I think it depends on like once the season starts. But I'm assuming I'm going to be working more with like minor league coaches. And it's the same thing about communication and making sure they know what the players are going through and what's happening and like how they're progressing. But then also checking in and like seeing their opinion on like how the players are doing. But I'm not completely positive yet.
I mean, the managers have to play a role in player development, right? Because you're actively
Absolutely.
tracking their players and they know
Mhm.
they spend a lot of time with their players. So I'm sure that someone is talking to the managers. I just don't know how much of a
No,
role that plays into what you do.
no, there's definitely a lot of communication with the managers because they are very important and they do know, like they see a lot of players go up and down and they do know like who's ready, who's not ready. Like they speak to the front office all the time because if the front office is looking at a guy and a manager is like, no, like he had a few good games, but mentally he's not there. Like that's something very important to know or to say like, he's had a few good games, but like I think I'm noticing something about like his swing is different or like he's throwing a little differently than he used to. He might be injured, like little things like that. Like the manager's going to notice and like other people might not because they're not watching it the games every day.
That's really interesting. I mean, baseball is so many people are constantly in communication about bringing athletes up and putting athletes back in the minors. And so that seems like a player development centric model. So it's really cool
Mm-hmm.
to have you to have your perspective and listen to this.
It's I think it's a very cool part of baseball, and I never thought that I would end up in this part of baseball. But also when I was working for the USC baseball team, I think that helped me learn a lot of things like about players and like the things they think of outside of baseball or the stuff they talk about on the bus or how they feel when they have really long bus rides. So I didn't even realize it, but I was preparing myself for life working in player development.
Would you ever work in player development for a different sport? Or
I think
are you baseball minded?
Um, I like I pretty much only know about baseball. Like I watch other sports obviously, and hockey is actually my favorite sport. So I would have to learn a lot about those sports like from a different perspective in order to work in player development or in any department for them. But I think I'd be open to it. I'm just definitely more interested in working in baseball.
Yeah, that's awesome. I mean, I've never actually spoken to anyone who works in player development, but I knew that that was a component of baseball that was crucial to the process. But it's really cool to
Mhm.
hear your perspective, especially working in the majors and also in the minor leagues.
Mhm. It's pretty cool and like obviously when you think like minor leagues it's like not as glamorous or it doesn't sound as fun to work in, but when I was working at the fall league I realized how exciting it is and how cool it is. Like there are fans with books and books of baseball cards for these players who like some of them I hadn't even heard of, and they're like, oh, I really want to get his autograph. Like I went to go see him when he was in Winston-Salem, and then I want this guy's autograph. Like I went to see him when he was in Peoria. Like just you'd be so surprised at how important minor league players are to some people, and obviously they're very important to like the organization. So it's really cool to see how it works and what their lives are like.
Yeah, when I was working with the minor league, they had a bunch of host families that would consistently follow their athletes that they had housed around the league and around the organization, and it was so cool to see them sitting like behind home and just yelling for their player like, "Hey, remember me?" But it's
And
just
I know with
so
Team
fun.
USA host families, it's similar.
Yeah, I mean, it was, and yeah, there was this kind of community that's built throughout the minors where you just follow these athletes for years and years and years, and you hope the best for them, and you hope that they get to the majors, and it's cool to follow and track their success.
And I will say in other sports, it's definitely easier to do. Like people love watching college football. And technically, if you think about it, that's like minor league football. So it's like everyone loves to watch their team. And then when their player finally makes it, it's like, wow, now I get to watch them professionally, like instant gratification. Whereas like with baseball, there's not a set, like they're going to play for 3 years or 4 years, and then they're going to go, like, it could take forever to follow a player.
Yeah, especially with, and this is getting back to your college football comment about college football kind of being the minors for the NFL. Now that players are getting endorsements
Mm-hmm.
and they're actively being paid to play, it is kind of a minor league system for football.
Yeah. And I personally love that. Like, I think, especially now with COVID, I think it's like becoming more apparent. Like, these players are professionals. They're making all this money for their school. And like some of the players who have gotten COVID and their career's over, it's like they played all these years, they put their body on the line, and then now they can't even make money off of it. Like, it's important to think of them as professionals because they kind of are.
Yeah, I mean they are such revenue building sports for their universities and their spokespeople
Mhm.
essentially. I mean, they're
Yeah.
getting as watched on social media as these major players.
Hmm.
So it is important to keep that in mind because although they are amateurs, they're not really because they're getting ready for the next step.
Exactly. And like even if you think of Olympians, like by definition they have to be amateurs, but then they can make money. Like they get their medals, they can like get cash prizes for breaking records. Like they're amateurs too, but they can make money. Like I think it's important to take a look at that definition, like the definition of the word amateur, and really think about like what does it mean?
What does it mean to you?
To me, it's hard to describe because I feel like it's someone who hasn't made it to the highest level of their sport yet. And I don't think it's fair to say, like, just because they're being paid, they're not an amateur anymore because, like, they aren't at the highest level. Like, even if they're getting paid to be the face of something or like they're in a commercial for something, like, they're still not at their earning potential. So I think it's okay for them to get a little bit of money and still be considered an amateur, or like even if they wanted to put an age limit on it depending on like which sport it was or something like that, like I would be fine with that, just because if someone is 24 and still in college and playing and they're probably going to get drafted, like you could say, okay, like they're 24, they're older, like they should be allowed to make money, but maybe like we won't call them an amateur, like something. I just feel like there's some way, there should be another way to be able to like define it, not just like they're not a professional, because like what does that mean? And like what makes it so Olympians aren't professionals, um but like anyone who makes money off of like selling a t-shirt with their face on it is.
Yeah, it used to be you're either an amateur or you're a professional, and there's nothing in between. You're either one or the other. But now that athletes are being paid for endorsements, it muddies the definition of an amateur.
Mhm. But also there are athletes like I've worked a little bit or I've spoken a lot with compliance people at USC, and they're athletes like if they had a business when they were in high school and they kept that business going and then they became a really big name, like they're allowed to have that business and continue to make revenue off of it. And obviously, if they become a really big name while they're still in college, more people are going to want to buy from that business. So it's like they're already making money off of it and it's their own idea. So what's to stop them from starting this business their freshman year of college instead of like their senior year of high school or something? Like it kind of seems almost unfair.
Yeah, and especially when you're talking about, for example, gymnastics, where your peak age is super young. How
Mm-hmm.
do you manage that kind of amateur versus professional characteristic of how you're being judged? I mean, you could be 14 and be a professional.
Yeah.
And
And
that's something that is not talked about enough, I don't think.
yeah, and actually, I never really think about gymnastics when I think of like the amateur professional um, like debate, but that is a really good one just because you can be making a ton of money off it. And then does that mean you're disqualified from being a gymnast when you get to college and you're like past your prime technically? And that doesn't seem fair because then you're just getting rid of a lot of really great gymnasts who could potentially be on college teams or like who could then go on to further their education just because of a random definition that was made up a long time ago.
Yeah, I mean, if you're hitting your peak at 14 or 15, that's barely high school. You're
Mm-hmm.
not even thinking about college yet,
And
potentially.
your money isn't your money at that point either. Like your
Yeah.
parents are taking care of all that.
So if you reach your peak at 15, then are you even interested in college coaches looking at you? I mean, I'm sure
Mhm.
that you are, but you have already done so much at such a young age that what else is there? And that's a
Yeah. And I think
conversation that's not baseball or football because those are kind of later in life successes.
because it's funny to think of like once you're retired in gymnastics, you like go on to college and then you compete in like a retirement league almost. And like I think of UCLA because they tend to have a lot of former Olympians on their team. And it's just weird to think of because they're like in the top of the nation and they're like the best of the best. And it's like they're considered past their prime.
Yeah, I mean, Caitlin Ohashi, she went viral,
Mhm.
but prior to her going viral and prior to her time at UCLA, she was an incredible gymnast. And
Mhm.
she had to go back to college after she
Mhm.
had already been famous and successful. And UCLA took her in and she had a lot of mental issues because she was so good prior to college and then she got to UCLA and it wasn't it wasn't where she wanted to be mentally.
Mhm. Yeah, and it's like I think something that also should be talked about more just in sports in general is like what happens after the fame or after you're done because like a lot of it is building up to it. So like baseball's really good because you slowly get to that point where like okay, I've made it and they've prepared me for the fame, but no one really prepares you for life afterwards. Like baseball does have programs to prepare you, but like no one ever wants to think of their life after they're past their prime. And with other sports, I'd imagine it's even harder because you like instantly get your fame and like there's no like talking about you for a few years. It's just like you're suddenly famous, and then if they drop you, you're suddenly not famous,
And
and that it has.
that's really applicable to football because you're only in the league for 3 years. So you work your
Mm-hmm.
entire life to get to the NFL and then in 3 years you're done, you're retiring.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, I was just on Clubhouse with a guy and we talked for probably an hour and a half about the process of athletic identity. And when you are done with the sport, who are you? Because so many people
Mm-hmm.
tie their identity to their ability to play a sport and be good at it. And especially like I mean, we both come from D1 perspectives, but it's there are programs in place at D1 colleges to make sure that that doesn't happen, but it's kind of impossible. And especially
Yeah.
when you're in a D1 sport that's as restrictive time-wise as football to late to let your attention go elsewhere, they major in things like communications and sport management, which are rather easy majors. They aren't not easy because you're still getting a degree, but they're not as labor intensive just because they have so many other things to do on the field. So then they graduate and maybe they don't make it to the NFL, or they only spend a couple years in the NFL, and now they have a degree that they just got in order to play football, and they didn't even really intend on using it, but now they have to.
Exactly. And like, I just think, or I think of the fact that like, for me, I played sports growing up, like all through my time in high school. And like when I was a freshman in high school, I knew I didn't want to play sports by college. Like I was like, I want to focus on medicine. Sports won't be part of my life, which I find really funny now to think about. But as soon as I got to school and I had that free time where it wasn't like you go to class, then you go to practice for one sport, then you go to practice for another sport. Cause I played 3 sports in high school. Like I didn't know what to do with my time. So in addition to needing money, like working in a sport, like baseball was perfect for me. But like even from a young, like sports were part of my identity, but I was still young and I had time to like figure out who I really was. I can't imagine going that deep into your life and then having to reevaluate who you are without sports.
And I think that that's something that player development needs to help with, because life outside of sport, you still have a lot of life to live if you're retiring at less than 30, you know?
Definitely. And like
So,
some people do find stuff like still within sports, like they become broadcasters, or they become like play-by-play people, or they become coaches. Like there are a lot of people who become coaches. But then for those who may have kind of just been like middle guys or like on the lower end but still professional, like that's really hard because you're working your whole life to prove that you're good enough. And then when you finally do it and it's done, like then what do you do?
yeah, there are a lot of clubhouse rooms that have former athletes in them. And I want to ask them, like, what are you doing? Because a lot
There's
of them are like motivational speakers. And I think that that's just an interesting kind of drop off emotionally from being the center of attention to motivating other people.
Definitely. And I was actually in a room, I think last week, and they asked like, okay, how many people here are former athletes? And then they said they set the definition of you had to play a sport in high school. And for me, that was like a low definition because I was like, for me, playing a sport in high school was a given. Like I was gonna be playing something. Like there was never a we had trimesters. There was never a trimester when I wasn't playing something. So being an athlete, like it was just part of my identity. But like once you get to college, that's like a whole other level of it. And I never really thought of the fact that like there are tons of people who don't play sports in high school. So like to some people, like I did compete at an elite level, but for me, I'm like, no, like now that I'm working in professional sports, being a high school athlete was absolutely nothing. So it's funny because like even people's definitions change of like what being a high level athlete is or what being a former athlete is. Like if it stops once your parents stop forcing you to play a sport, or if it stops like once you get to college, or if it stops like once you become a professional, like what is that definition of a former athlete?
Yeah, in my sports psychology classes in college, almost every single one of us was a former athlete, just trying to figure out how to implement athletics into the future of our life, if even if we weren't in a jersey on a field.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's a really
And I
cool.
think,
What were you saying? Sorry.
go on.
I just think that that's a great way to implement sports continually into your life, even once you're
Mhm.
not able to play anymore. Is that
Yeah,
what
it's a good way
you
to
were gonna
like
say?
slowly walk you. Yeah, it's a good way to slowly like walk you out of sports rather than just abruptly like that's it, you're done.
Yeah, and I think that that's why a lot of people struggle with athletic identity, because sometimes they are cut completely short. Sometimes they have a career-ending injury that they cannot come back from,
Mm-hmm.
and that's really difficult,
And
and I would not want to be in that position.
no, definitely not. And just like for me, like I feel like I lost my like biology identity, and that doesn't take a big toll on me because I don't think of myself as like mostly defined by my biology degree. But like when you're an athlete, you're mostly defined by the sport you play, so it's like very different in that way. Or like if you're an accountant, you're not mostly defined by your career. Like people think of like that, people always ask, oh, what do you do outside of your job? Like with sports, all they ask about is your sport, and like, oh, like how long have you been playing, what team do you play for? Like the all the questions are centered around that. So like having to switch gears and your life no longer being centered around that, or even just like your everyday small talk not being centered around that, like it's a big change.
Yeah, I mean, I think that you and I could talk about athletic identity all day because it is such a
Mm-hmm.
crucial part of the continuation of your life after sports.
Yeah, definitely.
So let's flip the table a little bit. What I always ask this to the people that I bring onto my podcast. What books are you reading currently that are pertaining to your job?
So, okay. This book actually does not directly have to do with my job, but it does have to do with mental health. So I guess kind of. And it's called Hidden Valley Road, and I just started it. And it's about a family of children, and most of them have schizophrenia. Sorry, I don't know if you can hear that, but they're taking the recycling out. It's about a family of children who mostly have schizophrenia, and just kind of figuring out like how they got it. And like it's the medical world talking about like, oh, is it hereditary, like what are the reasons for it, like different psychologists like evaluating them. And I just think it's a really interesting book that kind of relates because it makes you think like, okay, a lot of people like are born with these issues or like different mindsets, or like their minds just work differently. And there's not really anything you can do to change that, or there wasn't something in their environment that made them that way. So like if you relate that to sports, you could be like, okay, some people do struggle with mental health, and it's not because certain things happen to them or like anything particular. Like they may have just been born that way, and it's important to study and understand it so you know, I guess, how to best help it and how to best help them live with it.
Absolutely. What other kinds of content do you consume? Is it are they books? Are they podcasts? Are they studies? I mean, how are you consuming your content regarding your job?
A lot of it is social media because it is important to know like what players are like off the field. So like I love, well, so Trevor Bauer tweets a lot, for example.
Yeah, he does.
And before I followed him on Twitter, before like they made Twitter topics so that I could see what he was tweeting without following him, I didn't really know much about him off the field. So like it's way different to see like what his personality is like how he likes to interact with fans and how he has that ability. Or like David Price has a huge following on Twitter. He interacts with people. He lets people know like when something's going on or when he did an interview. Like that's, I think social media is a really good way to understand the sport and to understand, especially with baseball, where you might not get as much of their personalities. It gives you a good opportunity to like see into their lives a little bit more. So that's a big thing. I used to listen to a lot of random sports podcasts, just anything. Like if someone had an episode they recommended to me from any random podcast, I'd like give it a listen. So I liked that. And I like to listen to and like read things from multiple sports, not just baseball, just because like you can draw similarities, or you can say like, oh, hey, like this would be a good thing to try to implement like down the road in our sport. Like, I wonder why no one's thought of this yet. And generally, when you think, I wonder why no one's thought of this yet, someone has thought of it and it didn't work, or like it's in the process of being implemented. Um, so yeah, just kind of random. If anyone ever recommends like you should watch this movie about sports, you should listen to this podcast, you read this book, like I usually do it because no matter what, I'm going to find it at least a little bit interesting. I've only read one baseball book that I did not like.
Yeah, I have a lot of sports psychology books. My bookshelf is right there behind me, but there were a bunch of books about mental skills training and performance enhancement. And I just don't have many about the the business of the game. So I
Mhm.
wanted to see if you had any to recommend.
Well, the one that I really didn't like was actually called, I think it's called The Business of Baseball. But it was more about, I think it's because a lot of the business game or the business books are more about like how certain things came to be. So like how free agency happened, or how like agencies were formed, or agents came to be needed, or like the union was made. And like that stuff can get a little bit boring because it generally stems from like a lot of legal stuff, or a lot of like labor things that aren't as interesting. They just happen to apply to baseball or to apply to whatever sport. But I think there are a lot of people like in the front office, or a lot of books about people in the front office that people generally like, or like think are good. So like, I guess Moneyball is technically one of those books where it's like about less of like what's actually happening in baseball and more of like how to create a winning team.
Yeah, Moneyball's a great movie. I haven't read the book though.
It's it's
I'm
good.
normally the kind of
And
person who doesn't
the author,
read, who doesn't watch the movie before I read the book, but I did in that scenario.
I usually do one or the other because I hate already knowing what's happening. So like if I've already read the book, I'm not going to watch the movie. If I've already watched the movie, I'm not going to read the book. But like there are very few situations where I end up doing both, and Moneyball's one of them.
That's awesome. I had a question I wanted to ask you when you were talking about Trevor Bauer
Mhm.
from a player development perspective, when you see an athlete being vocal about some kind of cause that he believes in, how do you handle the fact that he might go off the deep end about that topic and get
Well,
some major hate from his opinions that he's vocalized?
I think in general, well, their agents actually do a lot to like help them in that aspect, because like the team will give them guidelines, not guidelines, but they'll say like we'd recommend like if you talk about certain things, like you should just know these are going to be this is going to be like the backlash you might face, or like these are the consequences, not from the team but like how the public may perceive it. So I think in general they get like a good basic understanding, and then their agents are the ones who are like, don't say that, or do you say that, or like if you say that, make sure that you're very clear with what you mean, because like some people are going to take it wrong, because like with agents a lot of it is like their image, because they're dealing with like sponsorships and brand deals and like that type of stuff, so that affects the agents more than it does the team. And Trevor Bauer's agent seems very similar to him in terms of like how vocal they are. Like they seem like very similar people, so it's like a good match in my opinion. So I think she, like anything he says, I'm sure she is well aware of what he's going to say beforehand, or at least like is keeping tabs on it. And even though she's similar, she would definitely tell him if he needs to take something down, or like, I don't know, that's a job as an agent. And like every good agent knows to keep very close tabs on your players.
Yeah, I follow him on Twitter and he writes paragraph tweets. And every
Mhm.
once in a while he'll go on an amazing rant. And I just feel like I'm favoriting every single one of his tweets because I agree with him. But there's a point where that could be detrimental to your public image. And I was just
Mhm.
wondering if you had any part in regulating that for the athletes, which I guess
No, we
you
don't
don't.
regulate it because I mean, they're adults at the end of the day. For him, I don't really know how it's seen by other teams, but I know like in general, like since teams do look at the whole picture, I'm sure that does affect like the types of offers he gets, because like some teams don't want players who are very vocal, some teams want players who express themselves, so it's going to affect what teams are interested in, what teams kind of pull away more.
He he had a tweet a couple days ago where he ousted some players for I think tarring.
Yeah,
It
yeah,
was
so
it
he
was a
tweeted that.
huge it was a huge deal.
So he tweeted it a few years ago, I think originally, or like last year. No, 2 years ago, he tweeted about it, and about how like there's a lot of people who do it. And then no one really said anything, or like he might have had some backlash, but I don't think his platform was as big back then when he first was saying it, or like people kind of ignored him more. And then he circled back to it because there was an article that came out about it, like regarding a specific team or like an employee from a specific organization. And then so he circled back and like started talking about it again. And I didn't completely follow what he was saying like the second time around. But yeah, it's like a major issue.
Yeah. Yeah, especially when you have an athlete that is so vocal. The second that they get some news that is detrimental to another player or another team or organization, that's kind of too much power at their fingertips, I think.
Yeah, but I mean, that's social media in general. It gives you too much power, but it also can like break you down. Like if you do one bad thing and you go on Twitter and your name is trending, like that has to hurt. Like that has to be terrible.
Yeah, I can't imagine. Especially if it's taken out of context and then you have to come out and say, this is not what I meant at all.
Mm-hmm. And like that's why it's hard, because like if you're in an interview and you say something by accident, you can kind of backtrack on it. But if you're on your computer and you type it out, you had the whole time that you were typing it out to think, is this really what I want to say? And like you chose to write it. No one asked you a certain question about it. So like that, I think that's why there's a big difference with like how people are perceived when they say certain things on social media versus like in an interview, when like you can just go back and say like I didn't mean it that way, or like they took it out of context, like you didn't get the whole story.
Yeah, I think that Twitter is both a blessing and a curse for PR firms.
Mm-hmm. Definitely.
But is there anything else that you think that I missed in this interview that you would like to talk about? Because we're winding down with our questions.
um no, I think that's pretty much it. I guess the one thing that I didn't want to talk about was the Players Alliance, which I don't know if you're familiar with it, but that recently was started like a few months ago by a bunch of different major league players. And pretty much what happened was like after like a lot like the racial injustice, they decided they'd come together, a bunch of different Black players, and they'd help mentor recently drafted players or like the younger players, because like there aren't very many of them. And I don't think I really understood how few Black players there were before this, because like you could go through all the like people that they follow, like the players that they follow, and you're like, oh, like I scrolled through that in like a couple seconds. Like there's barely anyone. And it's definitely very important to have players who you can look up to and who you think like are very similar to you, because it was able to connect players with other people who are in their same town, and like maybe they didn't even know it. Like maybe the younger guy knew it, but like the vet or the guy who just retired may not know much about this like random kid who was drafted, even if he was a first rounder. So like I think that is a pretty cool thing. And I think it's important for there to be even more mentorship programs just in general in MLB or in all sports, because like that's going to make a difference with like how prepared you are and like understanding the entire process that you're going to go through. So like I think that's a really great thing. And then they're also taking the opportunity to give back to their community. So like I think that's even better, like going around the country being able to help and being able to involve fans or different people who like follow baseball is super cool, because like a lot of people feel really far removed from athletes. Like I think when I watch football on TV, for example, like I don't watch it very often, but I'm just like, oh wow, like those NFL players, like they're stars, but I can never imagine the idea of like coming into contact with them. So like a lot of people for with baseball, it's the same thing where it's like, wow, they're a star. I could never imagine being near them. And now these kids are getting gear from them, or like getting the opportunity to work with them or hand stuff out with them. So like I think that's really cool and something to implement, just because it like puts a more positive mindset out there for the kids who potentially want to play the sport in the future. And then for the kids who are drafted and like have no idea what to do next and like need help, they now have someone to lean on. And like it's, if you have someone in your organization that you lean on and then you get traded, you kind of have to start the process over again. But if you have just like someone who's been through it all that you can lean on and that can tell you like, this is what you expect when you're traded, or like, this is what it's like, or like, sometimes it's not fair. Like that's going to be really nice to have that constant person throughout your career.
Yeah, I think that the process of being traded is a blessing and a curse depending on how you look at it, because now with social media, people aren't following necessarily an entire team's worth of players. They're following
Mhm.
this player from this team or this player from this team, and they will follow them across team lines.
Mhm.
And so that's comforting to kind of have your fan base move with you when
Definitely.
during the time that you're literally up and moving your entire family and life to a different city.
And I think I'm like, there's a player that I know of, and I think I mentioned this during the pre-interview. He was traded from the Indians to the Padres, and he's from San Diego. So it's like, oh, great, like you get to be home. Last week, he was just traded to the Yankees. So now it's completely different. His spring training is going to be in Florida. So it's not even like during spring training, he'll be anywhere near home. And like having to deal with being traded so like twice in such a short amount of time, being far away from your family and like not even having spring training with them for the first time. And he's like a little bit deeper into his career. So he suddenly has new things that he's never had to deal with before, like being that far away from family for such a long time. Like those are the types of things that you need someone who's been in your spot before to help you through. And like having an agent is helpful, but like at the end of the day, your agent is being paid. Like they work for you, like you're working together, like they're getting money off of it. So like maybe if you're not performing as well, they might not help you as much as you'd like. So it's nice to have someone who like is actually there for you on a personal level.
So, what impact do you think the Players Alliance will have down the road once it becomes a bigger part of how these players are connecting?
I think honestly it will grow the game a lot. Like it'll give little kids the opportunity to see, like if they continue to do things in the community, it'll grow the game because they're giving out gear, giving kids who don't have the opportunity to play something like to start off with at least. And obviously like with baseball, you need a full baseball field. So that's a little bit more difficult. But then also to know like when you're going through high school and you're like, oh my God, like this seems so hard. Like I don't have anyone to talk to, or like there's no one like me, to know once you reach that certain level, you're going to have a mentor waiting for you. Like I think that's a really good thing. And like that could keep someone from switching from baseball to football, which happens all the time. Like that could be the thing where it's like, well, in football, I'm just going to get there. I'm going to be on my own. Whereas in baseball, I'm going to get drafted. I'm going to have someone with me every step of the way. And I think like I'm the type of person who really needs to be guided through things like that. Little things like that, you don't think they're going to make a difference, but they do. So I think it's going to be really good for growing the game and for keeping kids involved in baseball.
Thank you so much for spending your day with me. It's
No
been an
problem. I
awesome
enjoyed
interview.
it.
And those are all the questions that I have. And I'll get this edited and I'll message you when it's being published.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Is there anything else that you want to either add or ask me? I mean, is there anything else that we have not discussed that you would like to?
I don't. Well, okay. One question. Oh, first of all, my name's pronounced Isha,
Yes,
or if you have to
I
say it
made a
in an
note.
intro or something.
Yeah.
Yeah, I figured you knew,
Is
but
your
I was
last
like, I
name
don't.
Rahman?
Yes,
Okay.
like the noodles.
Okay.
I figured you knew, but I was like, I don't think I said it at all in this interview, so it'd probably be
Yeah,
helpful.
you introduced yourself on Clubhouse, and I made a note in here when you did that. When I heard you introduce yourself at some Clubhouse room past after the pre-interview, and I made a note. I said Aisha, just so I didn't get it wrong.
It's also on my LinkedIn, and the like it has the little speaker thing, so it like tells you how to pronounce it.
That's cool.
And then I actually was curious, what made you want to do like something more like athlete mental health, or like what made you want to do a podcast on this topic in
Yeah.
particular?
So my degrees, I got a dual bachelor's degrees in 2019. So I have a bachelor's degree in broadcast journalism and also a bachelor's degree in sport and exercise psychology. So I came in as a journalism major, and I knew that I wanted to do sports in some capacity, but there wasn't anything specifically sports journalism at WVU at the time. So I got a job with the athletic department doing video production, and I
Mm-hmm.
was running camera, and I was doing replay, and I was doing directing and technical directing of our broadcasts for all of our sports. And that got me up close and personal with the industry, which was amazing. I mean, I worked there all 4 years plus another one after I graduated. And being in that close proximity to the athletes, which was a point that I found very able to be connected to.
Mm-hmm.
It was just where I felt like I belonged. And then I was also a beat writer for our women's soccer team and wrestling teams for our school newspaper.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm deeply entrenched in journalism and storytelling. And I thought that mental health is so stigmatized in sports, but it's something that every single athlete has a story about, at least one,
Mm-hmm.
that it's something that needs to be told. And I thought that a podcast would be a great way to do it. I love ESPN 30 for 30 podcasts, and their storytelling
Me
ability is so good. And that's what I want to structure my podcast about, but I want it to be mental health specifically. So I've brought in former athletes and sports psychology professionals so far, and I just think that they all have such different perspectives on the impact of mental health on their prospective games or their respective games, and the perspective is different depending on
Mm-hmm.
what sport they're in. So I have baseball and I have hockey and I have football, and they're all so different, but mental health is such a crucial part of how they compete on and off the field that it needs to be talked about more. And on Apple Podcasts, there is no one that is doing this. They're
That's
all
kind of
like there's like an
shocking.
episode, there's an episode here, there's an episode there, but there's no podcast that is specific to athlete mental health.
That's I think it's definitely something that needs to be talked about more, because even outside of your sport, it's nice to know like how different, like the different struggles different sports go through, or like how they might have similar struggles. And like if you're noticing a trend throughout different sports, and like maybe it's something that needs to be addressed by all the leagues rather than just like a team here and there saying like, oh, we've got a couple players with this issue. Like maybe it's something that larger that needs to be talked about. So I think that's really great. I also love 30 for 30s. And when I was like prepping for this interview, I was gonna mention that like I think player development is important, because like when you have an international player who comes in, like if you ever saw the one about like El Duque and Levon Hernandez, like Levon came, or they both came from Cuba. It's a baseball one, but they both came from Cuba, and Levon got to Miami and he had never had McDonald's before. And he ate McDonald's for every single meal. Like that's just like what he did. So he gained a ton of weight, and like little things like that you don't expect, like, oh, I have to tell these players not to eat McDonald's, but like you do. Or like high schoolers eat whatever they want, so you have to say like, hey, as you grow up your body's going to react differently if you keep eating all of this junk. So like little tiny things like that are really important in player development. And like with college students it's easier obviously because they have like their nutritionist, they're learning constantly like what to eat, what not to eat. But then they have their lives scheduled out from like 5 a.m. to like 8 p.m. And when you get to professional sports, you don't have that. So like they have to worry about their schedule. And that's like a completely different battle that they have to overcome.
Yeah, that's an interesting perspective, because I think from an outsider's point of view, you would think that professional sports are more regulated than college sports, but in reality, there's an entire department for athletic success and how you manage your day
Mm-hmm.
and the very limited free time that you actually have.
Exactly. And then there's players who, like, I feel like there's players who come into college and they kind of like have it all figured out. Like, luckily, like they probably could have been drafted out of high school and they already know how to do their own laundry and like they know all of those things. But you still have to deal with like, okay, I'm a professional. This is my job. And like thinking of it as a job, because once you're getting paid for it, it's completely different. And like in the MLB, you can show up to the field early if you want. Like some guys will show up like super duper early, like hours and hours before the game, to the point where it like doesn't even make sense. But for them, that's just the routine that they have to set in order for it to work for them. And like in college, you don't really do that because you have classes in between. Like you don't show up at 6 a.m. because by 8 a.m. you have a class.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean that there's so many topics about the mental health of athletes and mental skills training like anxiety reduction. And I think that that's what draws me to baseball specifically.
Mhm.
I love baseball. Like baseball is my thing, but I also appreciate the mental skills training that has to happen for sports like football and hockey. And although I don't know that much about this sport of hockey specifically,
Mhm.
hockey and football are insanely physical sports,
Mhm.
and they attract kind of the same people, and baseball is not like that.
Yeah. Like you can be
So
like skinny, twiggy little boy and you can play baseball, or you can be
yeah,
5'6" and play baseball. Like that hockey players are all like 6 foot and above. And same with football, they're like giant, like every single one.
yeah, and I think that every sport has their kind of hiccups of mental health where they're more susceptible to certain things. For example, pitchers and anxiety go hand in hand,
Mm-hmm.
and goalkeepers and anxiety go hand in hand. And there are
Mm-hmm.
specific positions, even from different sports, that work together in the way that they attack mental health training. And I think that that's what
Mm-hmm.
is able to draw sports psychology together, because although they are totally different sports and totally different types of athletes, mental health and mental skills are consistent throughout.
No, absolutely. I agree.
Well, that's all I have.
I think those are all the questions.
Okay, good. I'm glad I covered them. Um, yeah, I think that's really all. You slotted 12:30 to 2, and I think we're good. I think we're not gonna make it to 2.
Wow. Okay, that's good. We got pretty
Not
close.
pretty close though. Thank you so
So,
much.
um, no, thank you too. I really enjoyed doing this. This is my first podcast.
Welcome to the podcast world. It's a fun place.
Thank you. All right. Well, have a good day.
You too. I'll see you in some room on Clubhouse soon.
Yeah, definitely. I'll talk to you soon. Bye.
Bye.